So this final video is for advice for the final exam in the 2017 exam series for Edexcel Specification A. And this short video is going to talk you through how to answer the 5 questions that can be found in the final paper, which is the sources paper. And slightly different this video. On the left of the screen we have the exam paper with the 5 questions in. On the right of the screen we have the second booklet from last year, which is the booklet that contains the sources to help you answer the 5 questions. And then I will also be making reference as I go through this presentation to this PowerPoint, which gives advice on the 5 different questions. Okay, so for this paper you will have 2 booklets to use. You will have a booklet like the one on the left, and this is the booklet that contains the 5 questions. And then you'll have a second booklet which is much smaller, and that contains the various different historical sources that you need to answer the different questions. And some of the sources are written sources and some of the sources are visual sources, and they will all have a short piece of information printed at the top of each source, which is called the attribution. And you need that attribution especially for answering questions 4 and 5, where you're going to need to talk about the nature, origin and purpose of the source and how that affects the information that you can gain from the source. Okay, so first of all we will talk about question 1. This paper is exactly the same as the papers for the Cold War and Germany, in that unless you have extra time you will have an hour and 15 minutes to answer the questions. And again, there are some marks available for one of the questions, question 5, for the quality of spelling, punctuation and grammar. And also you should use the amount of marks available for each question as a guide to how long you should spend writing your answer. Okay, so first of all, question 1. Question 1 is worth 6 marks. So I would recommend that you spend about 8 to 10 minutes writing your answer. Personally, I would look to spend no more than 8 minutes writing your answer to question 1, so that you can have some more time answering the questions that are worth more marks later on in the paper. And question 1 will always use source A, and source A will always be a written source. And the question will say, what can you learn from source A about? And then it will be whatever the focus of the paper is. Now for last year's paper, the 2016 paper, it was looking at recruitment and rationing. So last year was focusing on key topic 3, which was the home front. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that this year the subject of the paper could be the suffragettes. It could be the liberal reforms introduced before World War I. It possibly could be the war itself, so the Battle of the Somme, weapons used during the First World War. Or potentially it could be looking at life after the war, so it could be looking at the role of women after World War I, and also it may be looking at the general strike of 1926. Okay, last year's paper though was focusing on recruitment and rationing, and the question is, what can you learn from source A about recruitment in Britain for the armed forces? The first part of this question will always be exactly the same. What can you learn from source A about? And then the remainder of the question will be relevant to whatever the focus of the paper is. As I mentioned a moment ago, you need to spend a maximum of 8 minutes writing your answer. And if you want to get full marks for this question, what you need to do is you need to make 2 well-supported inferences. And an inference is where you write down something that you can learn from this source about recruitment that isn't directly stated by the source. So this is very, it's an identical skill that you're having to use as you did for question 1A in the Germany paper. The only difference is that in the Germany paper, you only needed to make one inference to get 4 out of 4. For this question, to get 6 out of 6, you need to make 2 well-supported inferences. So, my advice for this question is as follows. Okay, you need to make 2 very well-supported inferences to gain the full marks, and I would strongly recommend using these types of sentence starters. One thing I can learn from source A is, and then you make your first inference. I can tell this because the source states, and then you need to give a quote from the source, and you show it's a quote by using quotation marks. And then a second paragraph, a second thing I can learn is, I can tell this because the source states, and then your second quote. You do not, for this question, need to analyse nature, origin and purpose, and there is also absolutely no need to add your own knowledge. Okay? The one thing that you need to make sure that you don't do is simply repeat what's written in the source. Okay? So you don't want to be putting things like, one thing I can learn from source A is that people's lives changed when Lord Kitchener and the world heavyweight boxing champion came to the local town, because that is just such a simple process. You're literally copying from the source. Okay, you need to be saying things like, one thing I can learn from source A is that peer pressure played a big role in forcing people to join up, because it talks, doesn't it, about his brother and lots of other villagers joining up. So we can learn from the source that peer pressure played a role in recruitment. That's an inference. It doesn't mention peer pressure anywhere in source A, but I can learn from source A that it played an important role in recruitment. Okay, question 2 is using source B. This is source B here. It will always be a visual source, potentially a poster, or it might be an article from a newspaper, or maybe a cartoon from a newspaper, something like that. And look very carefully at the instructions. It says study source B and use your own knowledge. Okay, so for this question, if you want to get close to 8 out of 8, you must make sure that you use details from the source and you also use your own knowledge. And the question is, what was the purpose of this representation? Why was this made? And it then says, use details of the poster and your own knowledge to explain your answer. Now for this question, I would recommend that you spend a maximum of 12 minutes. And there are 3 things that you need to write about in your answer if you want to gain the 8 marks. The first thing that you need to write about is the message of the source. And what I mean by that is, what is the source trying to make people think? Once you've written a paragraph explaining that, you then need to move on to talk about the purpose. So what is the source going to make people do? Once I'm thinking something from looking at the source, what is it then going to lead me to do? And then finally, what will the outcome be? So if the source fulfills its purpose, what will the outcome be of that? Okay? Or you could talk about why the source actually had to be created. What was happening at the time? And if you're talking about that, you're providing what we call context. And that means that you are able to provide your own knowledge. Here are some examples of some sentence starters. So, the message of source B is, and I'm then going to talk about what it's trying to make people think. The purpose of source B is, what is it? Once I'm thinking something, what am I going to do? If source B fulfills its purpose, the outcome will be. So what would happen next? Or I might talk about the context. So source B was created because at the time, and then I can start to provide some own knowledge. For this question, you really need to make sure that you back up the points you make with evidence from the source. That's especially important when you're explaining the message. So what it's trying to make people think and the purpose, what it's going to lead people to do. The source is going to be a visual source. So it may be that you have to describe elements of it. Use your own knowledge for the final paragraph to provide context. What I mean by that is explain why the source had to be made in the first place. What was going on at the time to lead to source B having to be made? And there is no need to analyse nature, origin and purpose for question 2. Now I'm going to give you an example now using a modern day source, and this is one I've referred to previously. It's this EE advert. Okay. So first of all, what's the message of this poster? What's it trying to make me think? Well, it's trying to make me think that EE is the cheapest mobile phone network and it has the best phones on offer. What's the purpose of it? Once I'm thinking that about EE, what am I going to do next? Well, I'm going to go to my nearest EE store or Carphone warehouse or wherever, and I'm going to sign up for that mobile phone contract, that £18.99 a month contract. What's the outcome going to be? Once I've gone and done that, what's going to happen next? Well, that £18.99 a month that I'm paying are going to increase EE's profits. And they are in competition with several other mobile phone providers such as Vodafone and O2. And so they're looking to attract new customers with cheap contracts and good smartphones. So here, I'm actually starting to include my own knowledge and I'm providing context. I'm explaining why EE have made that poster in the first place. Now for my first 2 points, where I'm talking about the message and the purpose, I would need to provide evidence from the source. And there's a lot of writing in this source, so I could actually give direct quotes from it. So that's how I'm going to back up my points. In that third paragraph where I'm talking about the outcomes of the source, I'm now using my own knowledge to explain why EE have made that poster. Okay. And time-wise, you're looking to spend, as I mentioned earlier, about 12 minutes on this question. Okay, next question, question 3. You're back to using a written source, okay, source C. And again, the question 3 is asking you to use the source and your own knowledge. And again, if you want to get the highest marks, if you want to be getting close to 10 out of 10, you must include your own knowledge in your answer. It says, use source C and your own knowledge to explain why, and then in this example, we've got to explain why the British government introduced rationing of food in early 1918. Right? Now, if you have a read of source C, you will see there are some reasons why the British government introduced rationing in 1918. But it won't give you all of the reasons why the British government introduced it. And so that's where you're going to need to give some reasons of your own. Now this question is worth 10 marks. So I would recommend you spend about 15 minutes writing your answer. It's asking you to use a historical source and your own knowledge to explain the cause of an event. You absolutely must include details from the source and your own knowledge to gain the highest marks. And you need to explain at least 2 causes of the question focus. So if we just have a look at the example again, you need to give 2 reasons why the British government introduced rationing in 1918. You need to give at least 1 reason provided from source C and at least 1 reason from your own knowledge. Okay? If you don't include own knowledge in your answer, you can only get a maximum of 7 out of 10. So it's really, really important that you do so. Okay? I've got some examples here of some sentence starters. So, source C suggests that the government introduced rationing in 1918 because, and then your first reason. I can tell this because the source states, and then you give a quote from the source. In all 5 questions, you must always back your points up, unless they are based on own knowledge, with quotes or evidence from the source. Another reason why the government introduced rationing in 1918 was because, and then you start to use your own knowledge. You do not need to analyse nature, origin and purpose. And if you're struggling for own knowledge, what you might want to do is see if you can have a look at the other sources in the paper, so sources A, B, D, E and F, and see if there's anything within those sources that are relevant to the question focus that you can pass off as your own knowledge. And there may be something in those other sources that helps jog your memory or that you can actually use and pass off as own knowledge. Okay. So, next question is question 4. And question 4 looks very similar to one of the questions in the Cold War paper, but there is a tiny difference with it. So it says, study sources D and E. So in this example paper, there's source D, a photograph of men queuing up outside a recruitment office. Source E is a written source. And it says, how reliable are sources D and E as evidence of recruitment in Britain for the armed forces in the years 1914 to 1916? And then explain your answer using sources D and E and your own knowledge. And again, this is worth 10 marks. So similar to question 3, you're looking to spend no more than 15 minutes on your answer, unless you've got extra time. Now, in the Cold War paper, you did a question that said, how useful are sources D and E? And what that was asking you is, how much can you learn from these sources? This question is different. It says, how reliable are sources D and E? And what that's asking you is, how far can you trust these sources as evidence of, and in this example it's recruitment, but in your paper it could be something completely different. Okay, so question 4 and 5 are the only questions where you're going to need to include an analysis of nature, origin and purpose for each source that you use in your answer. And when we talk about that, we mean nature is, what type of a source is it? Is it a poster? Is it a photograph? Is it a cartoon? Is it a speech, a diary or a letter? The example that's on the screen right now is a poster. Posters are usually produced for propaganda to try and persuade people to think or act in a certain way. Secondly, origin. When was it made? Who made it? This poster was made by the government during World War I. How do I know that? From the attribution at the top of the source. Does this mean that it's a biased piece of information? Very much so. And then finally, purpose. Why was it produced? What was it trying to get people to do? Who is it trying to make you support? Now, a critical thing to remember when you're analysing nature, origin and purpose is that no source is useless to a historian. There are positives and negatives to the nature, origin and purpose of any historical source. This poster is most definitely a piece of biased propaganda, but it was produced in 1917, so it gives us a good idea of what was concerning the government during the war. In this example, they were really worried about the country running out of food. So never forget, think about the positives and negatives of any historical source. So, question 4 is asking you how reliable are 2 sources. What this is basically saying is, how much can you trust the information that's in those sources? You need to write 2 developed paragraphs, just like you did for the question in the Cold War paper. These are the things that you need to include in both of those developed paragraphs. You need to make a judgment about how reliable the sources are. How much can you trust them? Are they very reliable, quite reliable, reasonably reliable? You need to give a judgment because it's asking you how far you can trust them. You need to give examples of reliable information from the sources. Okay, again, to do that, you need to quote the sources, or if it's a visual source, describe what's in the image. You need to give examples of things that are missing pieces of information from the sources. And this is again where your own knowledge will come into play, because you need to say, source D tells me this and this and this, however, it's missing this, and therefore it's not as reliable. Because if there's pieces of missing information, that reduces the reliability of a source. And then the final thing that you need to make sure you include is that analysis of nature, origin and purpose, and how that affects the reliability of each source. So if you have this example here, this photograph, a photograph published in a British newspaper in August 1914. It shows volunteers outside a recruiting office in London. Now we know that in the very first few months of World War I, there was huge excitement amongst the British population, and there was a huge rise in the numbers of people volunteering to fight in the First World War. And these sorts of cues were happening. So there's elements of this source that are reliable. We know that there was this early enthusiasm for the war, and that there were cues going around the corner of men looking to fight. But we also know, if you look at the question, it doesn't say 1914, it says 1914 to 1916. And we also know that during the war, that early enthusiasm very quickly tailed off, and the government had to start finding new ways of encouraging men to go and fight. So actually, the reliability of this source is reduced because scenes like this didn't last for long. So that reduces the reliability. Also, it was published in a British newspaper. We know that under the Defence of the Realm Act, all information and newspapers especially were censored by the government. And so this photograph is a piece of propaganda. It has been staged. Okay? Look at the fact that many of the men are actually looking directly at the camera. So again, that reduces the reliability of this source because it's been created and staged, or possibly staged, to make you think in a certain way. And I would do a developed paragraph on source D, and then I would do a developed paragraph on source E, and I would go through these four things in each paragraph: judgment, examples of reliable information, examples of missing information, and an analysis of nature, origin and purpose. And then I do that for source D, and then I do it for source E. Okay, the final question, question 5, is worth the biggest amount of marks. And look very carefully at the instructions at the top of this question. It tells you to use 3 specific sources. In this example, it's telling you to use source A, which you used for question 1, source E, which you use for question 4, and finally, for the first time, this source F. Okay? And it says study sources A, E and F and use your own knowledge. You'll also notice that there's a little asterisk next to the number 5, and that's telling you that spelling, punctuation and grammar are going to be assessed in this question. So there are extra marks available for good quality spelling, punctuation and grammar. You've then got a hypothesis. It says source F suggests that government methods to recruit volunteers for the British Armed Forces were unsuccessful. And it then says, how far do you agree with this interpretation? Use your own knowledge, sources A, E and F, and any other sources you may find helpful to explain your answer. Now this little instruction here is a bit misleading. Use any other sources to help. If you really want to use some of the other sources in the paper to help you answer the question, you can do. But personally, I wouldn't recommend it, because you don't get any extra marks if you do use other sources, and you also won't be penalised or punished if you don't use any other sources. So personally, I would just use the sources that they've given you. And the examiners will have deliberately chosen 2 sources, one of which will agree with the hypothesis and one that will go against it. So source F suggests that government recruitment methods were unsuccessful. And if you have a look at source E, that would back that hypothesis up. It says, recruitment is very low this week. So source E agrees with the hypothesis suggested in source F. If you have a look at source A, on the other hand, it actually goes against that hypothesis, and it gives the impression that recruitment methods were successful. So the examiners will always pick one source that agrees with the hypothesis and one that goes against it. But critical as well is this bit: how far do you agree? So you are going to have to give your own opinion. Do you agree with the interpretation or do you not? Okay? So, just some advice for this question. It's worth the biggest amount of marks. It's worth 16 marks, plus there are those additional 3 marks available for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So absolute minimum amount of time you need to spend on your answer is 25 minutes. Make sure you use the sources you've been instructed to use. As I mentioned a moment ago, you won't be rewarded or punished for using or not using any additional sources. Okay? But the critical thing here is if you don't use the sources that the question has instructed you to use, you won't get any higher than 8 marks. So really read those instructions carefully and make sure you follow them. As I mentioned a moment ago, one of the sources that you're asked to use will support the hypothesis, and the other source will challenge it. This is the only question where extra marks are available for quality of spelling, punctuation and grammar. And these are the things that you need to include. You must give a judgment about the extent to which the sources support or challenge the hypothesis. So again, going back to the example, source E strongly supports the hypothesis that methods used to recruit volunteers for the army were unsuccessful. And source A strongly challenges that interpretation because source A gives the impression that the methods being used were successful. So give a judgment about the extent to which the sources support or challenge. You need to give examples from the sources you've been asked to use about where they support or challenge the hypothesis. Again, this is where you need to use quotes. You also need to analyse nature, origin and purpose and think about how the nature, origin and purpose can help to explain the level of support or challenge of the hypothesis. And then finally, use a conclusion. And that final paragraph where you do a conclusion is a really useful place to give your own opinion. Do you agree with the hypothesis or do you disagree with it? And what are your reasons? You must explain yourself. So, here's some examples. Source X strongly supports the view that the work of women was the main reason Germany did not succeed in starving Britain out of the First World War. And then you'd select examples of how it supports that hypothesis. Source Z, however, challenges the opinion, and again you'd give some examples. And then in conclusion, I think for this question, a conclusion is a really useful way of then providing your own opinion on the hypothesis, which is what you've been asked to do. And a little bit like what I was saying with some of the earlier questions, what you could do is you could use details from the other sources in the paper as your own knowledge. And if you want to get 13 marks or better, you have to include some own knowledge. Okay, so it's really important that you do that. Just some final reminders. Use whatever question you're answering, use the question to frame your sentence starters. So refer back to the question in your opening sentences. This will really help you to make sure you're focused on answering the question. You must make sure that you back up any points you make with evidence from the source. If it's a written source, you're going to need to give a quote. If it's an image, you're going to need to describe it. Okay? It's really important that you back up any points you make with evidence from the source, unless, of course, you're using own knowledge. Make sure you include an analysis of nature, origin and purpose. Slight change there. You don't need to worry about question 3. It's just questions 4 and 5 where you must do an analysis of nature, origin and purpose. And when you're doing that analysis of nature, origin and purpose, remember it can always be positive or negative. For example, a diary only provides the opinion of one person, but a diary is likely to be very honest, as they're written not to be read by anyone else. So there's always positives and negatives to any historical source. Only include own knowledge when you're asked for it. Read the questions carefully. They will instruct you if own knowledge should be used or not. And if it does say use the source and your own knowledge, do so, because own knowledge is going to give you access to the highest marks. Ignore this bit here, okay? Unfortunately, for you guys, there used to be a paragraph at the start of the options booklet that was called background information, and it gave you kind of a little kind of summary about the topic of the sources. That's not included in your paper, sorry about that. Don't, under any circumstances, leave a question blank. Even if you only get 1 or 2 marks, that could be the difference between one grade or the next. Make sure you give yourself plenty of time to answer question 5. Unless you get extra time, you need a minimum of 25 minutes. Make sure you take care with spelling, punctuation and grammar on question 5, because that could be the difference between a grade. You could think about doing bullet point plans to organise your thoughts. If you're going to do that, don't take too long, because that's something that's optional. Some people it helps, other people don't find it's necessary. And use a highlighter to underline keywords in questions and also keywords in the sources as well. Your sources booklet by the end of the exam should be covered with highlighted bits of information and little notes around the edges of the sources of your ideas. All right, you should really pull apart those sources and have loads of ink on them with your ideas and the bits of evidence that you want to use. And good luck. You know, this is the final exam now. You know, you've done 3, by the end of this exam, you'll have done 3 really intense history exams. You've got some great grades in the bank for your control assessment, and this is the final piece of the jigsaw. So I wish you the very best of luck.